The Mocambo nightclub, Sunset Strip, Los Angeles, March 17, 1958. The room was filled with studio executives, directors, and talent agents nursing their third round of bourbon, the air thick with cigar smoke and the kind of ladder that comes easy when you're on top. Dean Martin was there for a charity benefit honoring veterans of World War II, sitting at a corner table with his usual glass of whiskey, relaxed in his tuxedo, comfortable in a room where most men were performing even when they weren't on stage. It should have been just another quiet Hollywood night. But nothing about this night would be normal, because sitting across the room was a Hollywood producer who had just decided to destroy the wrong man. Dean Martin's closest childhood friend. The Mocambo had hosted everyone from Sinatra to Monroe, its red velvet booths and crystal chandeliers, creating the kind of atmosphere where deals were made with handshakes and careers ended with whispers. Tonight, the room hummed with that particular energy that comes when powerful people gather to be seen being charitable. Dean sat quietly, occasionally nodding at familiar faces, but mostly observing. He had that quality, the ability to be fully present in a room while somehow remaining apart from it. Not distant, just centered. Across the room near the bar, his childhood friend Tony Amato stood in conversation with a small group. Tony wasn't famous. He'd never been famous. He was a lighting technician who'd worked his way up from grip work at Paramount. A kid from Steubenville, Ohio, who'd followed Dean to California years ago with nothing but a work ethic and a dream of making an honest living in the industry. They'd grown up on the same street, played stickball in the same alleys, shared the same flour-dusted childhood in their father's barbershops and bakeries. Tony had been there the night Dean's mother died. Den had been there when Tony's father lost everything in 1933. That kind of history doesn't fade just because one of you becomes famous. Tony looked comfortable enough tonight, laughing at something someone said, his rented tuxedo fitting reasonably well for a working man's budget. He'd been invited because the charity was honoring his brother, killed at Anzio. Dean had made sure Tony's name was on the list, had made sure personally. That's when Bernard Kosterman, the Hammer, Kosterman, noticed Tony standing there. Bernard Kosterman wasn't just any producer. He was the man who'd greenlit 14 consecutive box office hits for RKO. The executive who could make a phone call at 10 in the morning and have someone's contract terminated by lunch. He stood 6'2" with the build of a man who'd been an athlete once but had let bourbon and prime rib soften his edges. His silver hair was slicked back with pomade, his tuxedo custom tailored on Savile Row, his diamond cufflinks catching the light every time he raised his glass. He wore power like Colon, heavy and obvious. They called him the Hammer because when he decided someone was finished in Hollywood, he didn't just fire them. He made sure they never worked again. Not at any studio. Not in any capacity. He had assistants whose only job was to make phone calls, spreading quiet poison about whoever had earned his displeasure that week. He kept a leather-bound book in his office with names written in fountain pen, people he'd destroyed, a trophy collection of ruined careers. Tonight he had 2 lawyers flanking him, both young and eager, both laughing too loud at his jokes. An assistant hovered nearby with fresh drinks. This was a man who moved through life surrounded by servants. Kosterman had been watching Tony for the past 10 minutes with the kind of attention a cat gives a mouse. He'd recognized him from the Paramount lot. Remembered some minor incident from months ago. Something about Tony refusing to work unpaid overtime on one of Kosterman's productions. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that Kosterman had been publicly contradicted by a nobody. And Kosterman didn't forget. He drained his scotch and handed the empty glass to his assistant without looking. Then he walked directly toward Tony. Dean saw it happening, saw the trajectory, saw Kosterman's expression, That particular smile powerful men wear when they're about to enjoy themselves at someone else's expense. Dean set down his own glass and shifted slightly in his seat. His body language still relaxed, but his attention completely focused. Costerman reached Tony's group and inserted himself into the conversation with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that booming quality that demands attention, "I don't believe I've been introduced to everyone here." The group turned, and you could see the recognition ripple through them. This was Bernard Costerman, the Hammer. Men straightened their postures. Smiles became more fixed. Tony extended his hand. "Tony Amado, Mr. Costerman. I work lighting at Paramount." Costerman looked at Tony's hand for a long moment before taking it, the pause just long enough to be noticeable, just long enough to establish hierarchy. "Mutto," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "Yes, I remember you." There was something in his tone that made the temperature in that small circle drop 5 degrees. "You're the one who walked off my set last fall," Costerman continued, his smile never wavering. "Something about union rules and overtime, if I recall correctly." Tony kept his composure. "I followed the contract, sir." "Just like everyone else?" "Ah, just like everyone else," Costerman repeated, turning to the other men in the group as if inviting them to share in the joke. "You hear that? This lighting technician, this?" He paused, letting his eyes travel deliberately up and down Tony's rented tuxedo. "This working man thinks he's just like everyone else." One of the lawyers laughed. Just a short bark of sound, but enough. Tony's face colored slightly, but he held his ground. "I meant no disrespect, Mr. Costerman." "Of course you didn't," Costerman said smoothly. "Men like you never do. You just show up, collect a paycheck, and think that entitles you to rub shoulders with people who actually matter in this industry." He gestured around the room with his fresh drink. "Do you even understand what this event is? This is where the real Hollywood does business. This is where decisions get made about pictures that will gross millions. And you're here because—" He trailed off, making a show of thinking. "Actually, why are you here?" "My brother," Tony said quietly. "Joseph Amado. He died at Anzio. This benefit is honoring veterans." Costerman's smile didn't flicker. "How touching. So you're here on borrowed valor. Your brother's sacrifice bought you a ticket to a party you couldn't otherwise afford to attend." The words landed like a slap. The other men in the group suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere, to study their drinks, to examine the architecture. No one wanted to be associated with Tony now. Not with Costerman circling. This was how it worked in Hollywood. Power protected itself by making sure everyone knew the cost of standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Across the room, Dean stood up. He didn't rush, didn't make a scene, just rose smoothly from his chair and began walking toward the bar, his path taking him directly through the space where Costerman was holding court. But Costerman wasn't done. He was enjoying this too much. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do," he said, his voice loud enough now that people at nearby tables were starting to turn. "I'm going to make sure every studio in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are, Amado. The kind who hides behind union contracts. The kind who thinks showing up makes him equal to people who actually create things. By next week, you won't be able to get work changing light bulbs in a theater, mark you." Tony's hands were shaking now, just slightly. Just enough for someone watching closely to notice. But he kept his voice level, kept his dignity intact, even as everything around him was collapsing. "I've always done my job, Mr. Costerman. I've never asked for anything I didn't earn." "Your job." Costerman laughed, and there was genuine cruelty in it now. The kind that comes from a man who's discovered he enjoys the taste of someone else's humiliation. "Your job is whatever I say it is. Your job is whatever any producer in this town says it is. You're nothing. You're a name on a call sheet that gets replaced before the ink dries. And after tonight, you won't even be that." The room had gone quiet now. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that conversations at other tables had stopped, that people were watching now, waiting to see how this played out. There was an electricity in the air, the kind that comes when everyone knows they're witnessing something that will be talked about later. Dean arrived at the edge of the group just as Kosterman was drawing breath to continue. He didn't interrupt, didn't announce himself, just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting with the patience of someone who understands that timing is everything. It took Kosterman a moment to notice him. When he did, his expression shifted, becoming more guarded but maintaining that same aggressive confidence. "Deanne," he said, his tone changing to something that tried for collegial and landed somewhere near condescending. "I was just having a conversation with your friend here about the realities of working in Hollywood." Dean looked at Tony first, made eye contact, gave the smallest nod. The kind of acknowledgement that says, "I see you, I'm here, you're not alone." Then he turned his attention to Kosterman, and something in the quality of his gaze made the producer's smile falter just slightly. "That right?" Dean said, his voice carrying that same easy quality it always had, like he was discussing the weather or baseball scores, just explaining how things work. Kosterman said, trying to reclaim his momentum, "No offense intended." "None taken," Dean said. Then he smiled, that famous smile that had charmed audiences on 3 continents, and somehow it made what came next even more devastating. "But I think maybe you misunderstood something, Bernie, and I'd like to clear it up. Not just for you, but for everyone here who's watching." He glanced around the room deliberately, making sure everyone understood they were part of this now. "See, my mother, she died when I was young. Angela Crosetti. Came over from Italy with nothing, worked herself to death in a textile factory so her kids could eat. And before she died, she told me something I've never forgotten." Dean's voice was still conversational, but there was something else in it now, something that made people lean in to hear. She said, "Dino, when you make it, when you become somebody, don't ever forget that being somebody doesn't give you the right to make other people feel like nobody." She said that in this world, there are people who climb by building ladders and people who climb by stepping on backs. And she made me promise, made me swear on her deathbed, that I would never be the second kind. He let that hang in the air for a moment, watching Kosterman's face. "Now Tony here, he grew up the same way I did. His father owned a bakery in Steubenville. Got up at 3 in the morning every day for 40 years. Never missed a day. Never complained, just worked. Because that's what men from that generation did. They worked, and they took care of their families, and they didn't ask for anything they hadn't earned." Dean took a step closer to Kosterman. Not aggressive, not threatening, just closer, closing the distance between them in a way that shifted the geometry of power in the room. Tony followed his father's example, followed it all the way to Hollywood. Started as a grip, worked his way up to lighting technician, and he did it the same way his father made bread, with his hands, with his integrity, with the understanding that a man's word means something, that a contract isn't just a piece of paper, it's a promise. Kosterman opened his mouth to speak, but Dean raised a hand, gentle but firm, and the producer actually stopped. "I'm not finished, Bernie, because here's what you need to understand. When you decided to humiliate Tony tonight, when you decided to threaten his livelihood because he had the audacity to honor a contract, to do his job with dignity, you weren't just attacking him. You were attacking everything men like his father built, everything my mother died believing in. You were saying that none of that matters, That the only thing that matters in this world is how much power you have and how willing you are to use it to hurt people. Dean's voice had never risen, had never sharpened, but somehow it was filling the room now, commanding attention in a way that had nothing to do with volume. And I want to tell you something about power, Bernie. I want to tell you what real power is. Because I don't think you understand. He paused, making sure every eye in the room was on him. Real power isn't making people afraid of you. That's not power. That's just fear. And fear is the weakest force in the world because it only works as long as people believe you can hurt them. The second they stop believing that, the second someone stands up and says no, all that fear evaporates, like smoke. Kosterman's face was reddening now, anger mixing with something else, something that might have been the first edge of genuine uncertainty. Real power is making people want to stand with you, want to work with you, want to be better because they've been around you. That's power that lasts. That's power that builds things instead of just tearing them down. Dean reached out and straightened Kosterman's bow tie. A gesture so casual and so completely emasculating that someone nearby actually gasped. It was the physical manifestation of dominance, done so gently it couldn't be called aggressive, but understood by everyone present as a complete dismantling of Kosterman's authority. No, you've built your career on fear, on that book you keep in your office with all the names, on those assistants who make phone calls destroying people's reputations, on making sure everyone knows that crossing Bernard Kosterman means the end of their career. And I'll give you credit, Bernie. It's worked. For years, it's worked beautifully. He released the bow tie and stepped back slightly. But here's the thing you forgot. Here's the thing that's going to change everything for you starting right now. Fear only works when people believe there's no alternative, when they think they have to choose between bowing down to you or losing everything. But the second someone shows them there's another option, the second someone stands up and says, "I'm not afraid of you and you can't touch me," everything changes. Dean spread his hands, the gesture encompassing the entire room. Look around, Bernie. Look at all these people watching us right now. Every executive, every director, every agent, every actor. They're not watching to see what you'll do. They already know what you'll do. You'll bluster and threaten and try to reassert your dominance. That's what weak men do when they're challenged. The word weak hit Kosterman like a physical blow. You could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way his jaw clenched. No, they're watching to see what I'll do. Because right now, in this moment, I have something you've never really had, Bernie. I have real power. The kind that comes from people actually respecting you, actually wanting to work with you, actually caring what you think. And that power gives me the ability to do something you can't do. Dean's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it now. I can destroy you without making a single threat, without making a single phone call. All I have to do is tell the truth about what happened here tonight, about how you attacked a working man at a charity event honoring his dead brother, about how you threatened someone's livelihood because your ego couldn't handle being contradicted about overtime hours, about how, when it came down to it, Bernard Kosterman used his power not to create anything, not to build anything, but just to make himself feel big by making someone else feel small. Kosterman tried to speak, his voice rough. "You can't." "I absolutely can," Dean said, cutting him off. "And here's how I know. Because unlike you, Bernie, I've never asked people to be afraid of me. I've asked them to trust me, to work with me, to believe that when I give my word, it means something. And because of that, when I tell this story, when I tell people what I saw here tonight, they'll believe me. Not because they're afraid, because they trust me." He let that settle for a beat, So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Tony. You're going to apologize for insulting his brother's memory. You're going to apologize for threatening his career. And you're going to do it loud enough that everyone in this room can hear it. Everyone who just watched you try to destroy a good man for no reason other than your own petty grievance. I'm not going to. Kosterman started, but his voice lacked conviction now. Wes, Dean said quietly. You are. Because if you don't, I'm going to walk over to that microphone they set up for the speeches tonight, and I'm going to tell every person in this room exactly what kind of man you are. I'm going to tell them about the book, about the assistants, about every career you've ended and every person you've hurt. I'm going to make sure that by tomorrow morning, every columnist in this town, every reporter, every gossip merchant has this story. Dean leaned in closer, his voice dropping so only Kosterman and the immediate circle could hear. And then I'm going to do something you've never understood how to do, Bernie. I'm going to forgive you. Publicly, I'm going to tell everyone that you made a mistake, that you apologized, that you're going to do better. I'm going to give you the chance to save face. Not because you deserve it, but because that's what real character looks like. That's what real strength looks like. It looks like having the power to destroy someone and choosing not to. He straightened up, his voice returning to normal volume. But make no mistake, if you don't apologize right now, if you choose your pride over your common sense, I will make sure this moment defines the rest of your career, not through fear, not through threats, just through the simple truth of what everyone here witnessed. The silence in the room was absolute now. Even the bartender had stopped making drinks. This was the kind of moment people would talk about for years, the kind of story that would be told and retold, growing with each telling. Kosterman's face had gone from red to pale. His hands were trembling slightly. You could see him doing the calculation, weighing his options, realizing with growing horror that he didn't have any good ones. He'd built his power on fear, and he'd just discovered that fear had no power over someone who refused to be afraid. He started, his voice rough. Then he cleared his throat. I apologize. It came out as barely more than a mumble, the sound of a man choking on his own pride. Dean cupped his ear theatrically, playing to the room now. I'm sorry, Bernie. I don't think Tony heard you. In fact, I don't think anyone heard you. You want to try that again? Louder this time, so everyone can hear. Kosterman's jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscles jumping in his cheeks. His lawyers were staring at the floor. His assistant had disappeared entirely. Every person who'd been standing with him had found a reason to take a step back, to distance themselves from what was happening. I apologize, Kosterman said, louder now, the words clearly costing him something vital. To Mr. Amato, for my comments about his brother, and for threatening his career. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. That's better, Dean said. He turned to Tony, who was standing perfectly still, his eyes wet, his posture rigid with the effort of maintaining his composure. That sound good to you, Tony? Tony nodded, not trusting his voice. Dean turned back to Kosterman, and now there was no smile at all, just a flat, calm certainty. One more thing, that book you keep. The one with all the names. I want you to burn it. Tonight, and I want you to call every studio you've ever contacted about blacklisting someone, and I want you to tell them to disregard whatever you said. You've got 1 week. You can't. I absolutely can, Dean said. And you absolutely will. Because if you don't, we're going to have this conversation again. Except next time it won't be private. Next time it'll be on television. I'll go on every talk show, every interview, every public appearance, and I'll tell this story. And unlike you, Bernie, when I tell people something, they believe me. He clapped Kosterman on the shoulder, the gesture friendly and completely devastating, like patting a child who just embarrassed themselves. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Bernie, and think about what I said. About the difference between fear and respect, between power that tears down and power that builds. You've got the rest of your life to figure out which one you want to be remembered for. Then Dean turned and walked back toward his table, Tony following a few steps behind, and the room stayed frozen for another beat before conversation slowly, awkwardly resumed. But everything had changed. The balance of power had shifted visibly, undeniably, and everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed something that would echo through Hollywood for years to come. Kosterman stood there for a long moment, his lawyers finally looking up, unsure what to do, how to act, whether they were still employed. Then he walked stiffly toward the exit, his departure noticed by everyone and commented on by no one. The man who'd entered that room as one of the most feared producers in Hollywood left it as something else entirely. Something smaller. Something that would never quite regain its former size. Dean led Tony through the crowd to a quiet alcove near the coat check, away from the eyes and whispers. The moment they were alone, Tony's composure finally cracked. His hands were shaking, his breathing uneven, his eyes filling with tears he'd been holding back for the past 20 minutes. "Dean, His voice broke. "You didn't have to do that." Dean turned to face him fully, his expression serious now, all the performance stripped away. "Yeah, I did. He could destroy you too," Tony said, the words tumbling out. "He's got connections, he's got power. He could. He's got nothing." Dean interrupted gently. "That's what you saw tonight, Tony. All that power, all that fear he built, it was just smoke. And smoke disappears the second someone stops pretending it's solid." Tony's tears spilled over now, running down his face unchecked. "My brother Joey, he died thinking he was making the world safer, thinking that standing up to bullies mattered. And tonight, in this stupid nightclub, you proved he was right." Dean pulled him into an embrace, and Tony didn't resist, just let himself be held. These two men from Steubenville holding each other while Hollywood's elite pretended not to notice from the main room. "You're my brother, Tony," Dean said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Not by blood, but by everything that matters. And brothers don't let brothers stand alone. Not ever. Not for anything." Tony's voice was muffled against Dean's shoulder. "Joey would have liked knowing you had my back. Joey taught me how," Dean said. "Remember that night behind your dad's bakery? When Bobby Mancini tried to shake me down, Joey didn't even hesitate. Just stepped between us and said, 'You want Dean, you go through me.' That's what brotherhood looks like, Tony. That's what it's always looked like." They stood like that for a long moment, while beyond the alcove the party continued. Music playing, glasses clinking, people laughing and making deals and pretending the world was exactly as it had been before. But it wasn't. Something fundamental had shifted. Not just for Tony, not just for Kosterman, but for everyone who'd witnessed what happened when quiet strength met loud cruelty and won. When they finally pulled apart, Tony wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, managing a weak laugh. "I'm a mess. You're a man who just got attacked for honoring his brother," Dean said. "You're allowed to be a mess." They walked back to Dean's table together, and Dean poured Tony a drink from his personal bottle, the good stuff he kept for himself and friends. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the room slowly return to normal, or what passed for normal after what had just happened. "What happens now?" Tony asked finally. Dean shrugged, his expression calm. "No. You go back to work Monday morning. You do your job the way you've always done it, with integrity, with dignity, and if anyone gives you trouble, you tell them to call me. And Kosterman." "Kosterman learns an important lesson," Dean said. "Or he doesn't. Either way, he's not your problem anymore. He's his own problem. That's how it works when you build your whole life on fear. Eventually someone calls your bluff, and then you've got nothing left to stand on. Tony nodded slowly, then raised his glass. To Joey, and to brotherhood. Dean raised his own glass. To people who stand up when it matters, even when it costs them everything. They drank, and around them the party continued, but neither of them was really there anymore. They were back in Steubenville, two kids playing stickball in an alley, making promises about loyalty and friendship that seemed simple then but turned out to be the most complicated, most important things they'd ever learn. The story of that night spread through Hollywood like wildfire. By the next morning, every assistant, every agent, every studio head knew what had happened at the Mocambo. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the core remained the same. Bernard Kosterman had tried to destroy a working man for no reason, and Dean Martin had stopped him. Not with violence, not with his own threats, but with something more powerful, with truth delivered calmly, witnessed by everyone who mattered. Within a week, Kosterman's assistants were making phone calls, just as Dean had demanded. Disregard our previous recommendations regarding the following individuals. The blacklist that Kosterman had spent years building began to crumble. Names that had been poisoned became viable again. Careers that had been ended quietly resumed. At Paramount, a young actress who'd been told she'd never work again after rejecting Kosterman's advances got called in for 3 auditions in 1 week. At RKO, a director who'd been blacklisted for refusing to fire union workers found himself back on the lot, discussing a new project. At Warner Brothers, a screenwriter whose name had been removed from credits discovered his work was suddenly being reconsidered. The machinery of Hollywood that had made Kosterman powerful began, slowly but inexorably, to grind him down instead. Projects he'd greenlit were quietly reassigned. Phone calls went unreturned. Meetings were canceled. His influence, built on fear and maintained through intimidation, evaporated the moment people realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore. By 1959, Kosterman's production deal at RKO wasn't renewed. He moved to a smaller studio, then a smaller one still. The decline was steady, unremarkable, the kind of slow fade that Hollywood specializes in. No dramatic fall, just a gradual dimming until one day you realize the person who used to command every room they entered can't get a table at Musso and Frank. He died in 1967, largely forgotten. His obituary in Variety was 3 paragraphs, mentioning his early successes and none of his later years. The leather-bound book of names was found among his possessions after his death and quietly destroyed by his embarrassed daughter. Tony Amato, meanwhile, continued working at Paramount. He became a lighting director within 2 years of that night at the Mocambo, then a cinematographer by 1965. He worked on 12 films that were nominated for Academy Awards. He became known in the industry as someone who treated every crew member with respect, who remembered what it was like to be starting out, who understood that dignity wasn't about your title, but about how you carried yourself. When he retired in 1988, his going-away party was attended by 300 people. Directors he'd worked with, actors whose faces he'd lit, grips and gaffers who'd learned their trade under his patient instruction. And in the back of the room, at a table by himself until Tony spotted him and waved him over, sat Dean Martin. They found a quiet corner away from the crowd. These 2 old men now, their hair thin and gray, their hands spotted with age. But when they looked at each other, they were still those kids from Steubenville. "Hell of a career you built," Dean said, gesturing at the crowd. Tony's eyes were wet. "Wouldn't had a career without that night, without you. You earned every bit of this yourself," Dean said firmly. "I just made sure one asshole didn't end it before it got started." "It was more than that." Tony's voice was quiet but intense. "You saved something in me that night. Not just my job, my faith, My belief that the world could be fair, that good people could win, that standing up for what's right actually mattered. He reached across and gripped Dean's hand. "You're my brother, Dean, not by blood, but by everything that matters. And I need you to know." His voice broke. "What you did that night, it didn't just save my career. You saved my soul." Dean's eyes were wet too now. "You would have done the same for me. Joey would have done the same for me. That's just how we were raised. That's how family works." "I know," Tony said. "And that's why it mattered so much. Because you didn't think twice, didn't calculate the cost. Just saw someone trying to hurt me and decided that wasn't going to happen. Not on your watch." They sat together as the party continued around them, two old men holding on to a friendship that had survived fame and distance and decades, that had been tested in a Hollywood nightclub and proven stronger than fear, stronger than power, stronger than anything the world could throw at it. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995. Christmas Day. The funeral was attended by hundreds, celebrities, musicians, actors, directors, people whose lives he'd touched in ways large and small. But the front row was reserved for family and the closest of friends. Tony Amato sat in that front row, 83 years old, his body frail, his hands shaking with age and grief. When they asked if anyone wanted to speak, Tony stood slowly, gripping the pew for support, and made his way to the podium. "Dean and I grew up together," he began, his voice surprisingly strong. "Same street in Steubenville. Same dreams of something bigger. And when we both ended up in Hollywood, we made each other a promise that no matter how big we got, no matter how much success we found, we'd never forget where we came from. Never forget that being somebody doesn't give you the right to make other people feel like nobody." He paused, composing himself. "There was a night in 1958 when someone tried to destroy me. Someone powerful, someone feared. And Dean didn't hesitate. He stepped between me and destruction without thinking twice, without calculating the cost. Just saw his friend in trouble and decided that wasn't going to stand." Tony's voice broke. That's who Dean was. Not the singer, not the actor, not the star. The man who stood up when it mattered. The man who chose character over convenience. The man who understood that real strength isn't about volume or intimidation, but about quiet courage when someone you love needs you. He looked at the casket, tears streaming down his face. "You were my brother, Dean, and you taught me what that word really means. Not blood, not obligation, but choice. Choosing to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. That's brotherhood. That's love. That's Dean Martin." Tony sat down to silence, and in that silence, 300 people understood. They just heard the truth about a man who'd spent his life making it look easy, making it look effortless, when the reality was that every moment of grace, every act of kindness, every time he'd stood up for someone who couldn't defend themselves, had been a choice, a conscious decision to be better than the world required him to be. Tony Amato died 8 years later in 2003. His children found a letter among his possessions, written in Dean's handwriting, dated March 18, 1958, the morning after the Mocambo. "Tony, about last night, don't give it another thought. That's what friends do. Your brother would have done the same for me, and you would too. That's all there is to it. Stay strong. Stay honest. Don't let the bastards grind you down. Your friend always, Dean." That letter is now in the Academy of Motion Arts and Sciences archive, preserved in climate-controlled storage, available for researchers studying Hollywood history. But what it represents is bigger than Hollywood, bigger than movies or music or fame. It's evidence that in a world that often rewards cruelty, that celebrates power over principle, that makes heroes out of people who step on others to climb higher, there are still moments when character wins. When loyalty matters more than career. When someone stands up and says this isn't right, and I'm not going to let it happen. March 17, 1958. The Mocambo nightclub, Sunset Strip. A powerful man tried to destroy someone who couldn't fight back. And another man, a better man, stepped between them and proved that real strength doesn't need volume, real power doesn't need threats. And real character reveals itself not in what you say but in what you do when someone you love needs you. That night proved something Hollywood too often forgets. That friendship matters more than fear. That protecting someone you love is worth any risk. That the truest measure of a man isn't what he does when cameras are rolling or when there's something to gain, but what he does when someone he cares about needs him, and standing up means risking everything. The night brotherhood defeated cruelty. The night quiet courage changed lives. The night Dean Martin showed everyone watching that real power isn't about making people afraid. It's about giving them hope, worth remembering.